Good evening. It's Friday, September 18th. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is dead. Ginsburg dies at her home in Washington from pancreatic cancer at the age of 87. Ginsburg's death gives President Trump the opportunity to appoint a conservative justice to the court, even if he loses the November election, further cementing a right-wing court majority likely to last for years. Democratic vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris on a turn up and turn out the vote virtual bus tour this weekend in order to mobilize the African-American vote for this November. President Trump announces the release of $13 billion in assistance to repair years-old hurricane damage in Puerto Rico, brushing aside his past bitter treatment of the island and its leaders as he courts Puerto Rican voters in the U.S., particularly in the crucial swing state of Florida. U.S. health officials drop a controversial piece of coronavirus guidance and telling all those who have been in close contact with infected people to get tested. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention essentially returns to its previous guidance about such tests. In doing so, it got rid of language posted last month that said people who didn't feel sick didn't need a test. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says a second wave of the coronavirus is coming, sweeping across Europe. And San Francisco's progressive district attorney Chesa Boudin announces he's formed an innocence commission to evaluate criminal convictions that may have been wrongfully concluded. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a towering women's rights champion who became the High Court's second female justice, died today at her home in Washington. She was 87 years old. The court said Ginsburg died of complications from metastatic pancreatic cancer. Her death just over 6 weeks before Election Day is likely to set off a heated battle over whether President Trump should nominate, and the Republican-led Senate should confirm her replacement, or if the seat should remain vacant until the outcome of Trump's race against Democrat Joe Biden is known. Ginsburg announced in July that she was undergoing chemotherapy treatment for lesions on her liver, the latest of her several battles with cancer. She spent her final years on the bench as the unquestioned leader of the court's liberal wing and became something of a rock star to her admirers. Young women especially seemed to embrace the court's Jewish grandmother, affectionately calling her the notorious RBG for her defense of the rights of women and minorities, and the strength and resilience she displayed in the face of personal loss and health crises. Those health issues included 5 bouts with cancer, beginning in 1999, falls that resulted in broken ribs, insertion of a stent to clear a blocked artery, and assorted other hospitalizations after she turned 75 years old. She had resisted calls by liberals to retire during Barack Obama's presidency at a time when Democrats held the Senate and a replace with similar views could have been confirmed. Instead, Trump will almost certainly try to push Ginsburg's successor through the Republican-controlled Senate and move the conservative court even further to the right. Ginsburg antagonized Trump during the 2016 presidential campaign in a series of media interviews, including one calling him a faker, although she apologized later. Before her appointment to the court, Ginsburg argued 6 key cases before it during the 1970s when she was an architect of the women's rights movement. She won 5 of them. Ruth Bader Ginsburg does not need a seat on the Supreme Court to earn her place in the American history books, Bill Clinton said at the time he nominated her. She has already done that. Ginsburg was perhaps personally closest on the court to the late Antonin Scalia, her ideological opposite. Ginsburg once explained that she took Scalia's sometimes biting dissents as a challenge to be met, saying, "How am I going to answer this in a way that's a real put-down?" When Scalia died in 2016, also an election year, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refused to act on President Obama's nomination of Judge Merrick Garland to fill the opening. The seat remained vacant until after Trump's surprising presidential victory. Trump had said he would move to confirm a Trump nominee if there were a vacancy this year. Conservative Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts mourned Ginsburg's passing, saying in a statement, "Our nation has lost a jurist of historic stature. We at the Supreme Court have lost a cherished colleague. Today we mourn, but with confidence that future generations will remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg as we knew her, a tireless and resolute champion of justice." There will be a candlelight vigil tonight at Harvey Milk Plaza in the Castro district of San Francisco to honor the life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Interested participants are urged to bring candles. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris today launched a series of virtual events that they're calling the Turn Up and Turn Out the Vote virtual bus tour. The events, which will be held in several swing states over the course of the weekend, are meant to inspire African American voters to turn out in the November election. Harris began the series today with a voter registration and early vote rally in the state of North Carolina. KPFA's Kate Eder reports.
Today is National Black Voter Day, an event created this year by the National Urban League, Black Entertainment Television, and several civil rights organizations to inspire Black voters to turn out in the November election. At a virtual rally in North Carolina, Kamala Harris urged Black Americans to register and make plans to vote.
There is so much at stake in this election. We are in the middle of battling a deadly pandemic. We're in the midst of an economic crisis people are comparing to the Great Depression. And we are in the midst of a long overdue and a continual fight for a reckoning on race and justice in America. And ordinary working people are looking at the job market and wondering, who is fighting for me? Well, that is exactly what Joe and I are prepared to answer, which is we will fight for you.
The event was part of the Turn Up and Turn Out the Vote virtual bus tour, which will travel to different swing states over the course of the weekend and hold events with members of the Congressional Black Caucus. In the wake of the protests for racial justice, which have spread across the nation over the past months, Harris highlighted her and Biden's campaign promises to reform policing and the criminal justice system. She pledged that the Biden administration would create a National Police Oversight Commission to review and monitor police departments, and that they would eliminate the use of chokeholds by police officers. Harris also promised to eliminate the death penalty, mandatory minimum sentences, cash bail, and private prisons, and said she and Biden would decriminalize marijuana use across the country and expunge all marijuana conviction records. Harris also appealed directly to young voters and college students, especially those who attend historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs.
Joe and I will invest over $70 billion in HBCUs and minority-serving institutions. And we will fight to forgive student loan debt for people who are making less than $125,000 when you come out of school. And also we will cancel $10,000 of student loan debt for all students, regardless of what you make. For students who are coming from families that make less than $125,000, if you attend a public school, you will attend tuition free. If you attend an HBCU, whether it is private or public, it will be tuition free.
Harris also highlighted her and Biden's pledge to provide free testing, treatment, and vaccinations for COVID-19, and said they would create a public health national jobs corps, which would hire 100,000 people to help with testing and contact tracing. She said they will work to provide access to loans and capital specifically to underserved communities of color, which have been hit especially hard by the pandemic. L.T. McCrimmon, the director of the Biden-Harris campaign in North Carolina, says Biden's policies will help working-class Black families.
The vice president has laid out a plan where he wants to put families back to work, ensure that folks have $15 minimal living wages. He wants to make sure that child care is affordable for families. We can't take this election lightly. This is the most important election of our lifetime, and our communities have tremendous power here. I think we all know what the right choice is, and that's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Throughout his campaign, Biden has detailed his plans to address issues that Black Americans face. He has vowed to address institutional racism in his first 100 days in office. According to the New York Times, Biden and Harris hope to recapture the high levels of Black voter turnout last seen when Obama ran for president. The Pew Research Center reports that in 2008, around 65% of eligible Black voters participated in the election, and in 2012, Black voter turnout reached a record high level of 66.6%. Black voter turnout fell significantly in the 2016 election, dropping to just over 59%. Biden and Harris want to change that. North Carolina Democratic Representative Alma Adams encouraged Black Americans to vote early this year.
We're going to have to turn out, and we're going to have to turn out really big. Now, somebody's going to make a decision for and about us, most times without us. You should be able to control those of us who make those decisions on your behalf. Now, when good people don't go to the polls to vote for good people, bad people get elected, and they do awfully bad things to good people. We see that that has happened to us over and over and over again, and particularly over the past 4 years. So I think that the difference is going to be made by the young people.
The New York Times reports that voter turnout is expected to be exceptionally high in 2020. Many Black Americans report being more motivated to vote this year than they were in 2016. National Black Voter Day coincides with the first day of early voting in South Dakota and Minnesota. Events are also happening today in Georgia, Wisconsin, Virginia, Texas, and Pennsylvania, which are crucial states that Biden and Harris hope to win with the help of Black voters. Reporting for KPFA Pacifica Radio, I'm Kate Ida.
You may remember the infamous scene from 2017 when President Trump went to Puerto Rico to view the extensive damage from Hurricane Maria and ended up contemptuously tossing rolls of paper towels into a crowd at an island church. Today at the White House, Trump tossed figurative bags of cash at Puerto Rico in a transparent attempt to buy the presidential vote of mainland Puerto Ricans, especially those in the key battleground state of Florida. Trump announced the release of nearly $13 billion to Puerto Rico to help rebuild the electrical grid and repair schools from the devastation of Hurricane Maria 3 years ago, amid criticism that the aid was long overdue and was being released now only for political purposes. Trump blamed the delay on Democrats in Congress, who had approved the funding and who had then pushed for its release.
Mr. President, this huge aid package to Puerto Rico, why not a year ago? Why not 2 years ago? Why not 3 years ago? Why 46 days to the election?
Because what we're doing is we've been working on it for a long time to get it passed. Very tough to get things past Democrats where they don't want to see this happen. And they certainly didn't want to see it happen at this point.
Trump in the past has opposed providing additional aid to Puerto Rico, arguing it had received too much already and expressing concern that the money would just be wasted or misspent. Trump dismissed that history as he discussed the aid disbursement at the White House today and pledged to revitalize Puerto Rico's pharmaceutical and medical equipment manufacturing industry, which has been in decline in part due to the 1996 repeal of tax incentives, which Joe Biden voted for as a member of the Senate.
I just want to say, by contrast, Biden's devastated the island of Puerto Rico. Joe Biden, what he's done to Puerto Rico, meaning the past administration, is devastating. In 1996, Biden voted to eliminate a critical tax provision that had allowed Puerto Rico to become a dominant player in global pharmaceutical manufacturing. That's what happened. When Biden voted to repeal this provision, the pharmaceutical industry was ripped out of Puerto Rico. all incentive to stay there was taken away. And all of the jobs went to China and other places, but mostly to China. That's what happened. This was done with a vote of Biden. This was even before the Obama administration. This was early on, but so sad that was done. And then Obama came in, and it got worse. So for the people of Puerto Rico, they were a disaster for you. And I have to say, in a very nice way, a very respectful way, I'm the best thing that ever happened to Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rican Governor Wanda Vasquez thanked Trump and the government for the grant, among the largest ever awarded by the Federal Emergency Management Agency for disaster relief. Representative Nydia Velázquez, a New York Democrat, said the timing was notable, saying the Trump administration delayed, dragged its feet, and resisted allocating these badly needed funds. Said Velázquez, who was born in Puerto Rico. Now, she said, 46 days before the election, the administration has finally seen fit to release them. You're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. Mobilizing young voters is a challenge even without a pandemic. But a Nevada grassroots group is taking advantage of changing technology to reach them, especially Latinos voting for the first time. Roz Brown reports.
Bob Fulkerson with the Progressive Alliance of Nevada says since the Plan Group launched in 1994, Nevada's demographics have changed dramatically. In those 26 years, the percentage of Nevadans of color has grown from 21% to 52%, and many will be voting for the first time. He says Plan is reaching out using new technologies and hearing a lot of frustration that people hope to resolve at the ballot box.
What we're hearing is people are frustrated, people are anxious, people are hurt, and people are resolute to do something about the chaos that they find our country and our communities in.
Nearly 20% of eligible voters in Nevada are Latino, which is the sixth largest Hispanic eligible voter share nationally, according to the Pew Research Center. Data from the U.S. Census Bureau shows that one Latino in the U.S. turns 18 every 30 seconds and becomes eligible to vote. Fulkerson says the pandemic has forced Plan to get creative with reaching voters. Instead of going door to door, smartphones and video conferencing are being used. And while the contact isn't as personal, he says hundreds and even thousands of people can be reached, and most want to talk about issues important to them.
The voters that have turned out in the last election are saying, of course I'm going to be there. The people for whom this is the first time need some nudging. They need some conversation.
Nevada has voted Democratic in presidential elections since 2008, but polls show the race between Democratic candidate Joe Biden and President Donald Trump tightening in the past few weeks. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
An Ohio judge has temporarily blocked the Republican Secretary of State's order limiting counties to one ballot drop box. Both the state and the Republican Party have appealed. The face-off over Secretary of State Frank LaRosa's directive makes unclear how many drop boxes will be available to voters in the presidential battleground less than 3 weeks before voting begins. Access to drop boxes has become an urgent matter nationally amid the coronavirus pandemic and questions about mail-in voting security and cutbacks at the post office. Urban counties, which tend to favor Democrats, are often the ones that opt for drop boxes. A judge has cleared the way for more absentee ballots to be counted in Michigan, another key battleground state. Envelopes postmarked by the eve of the November 3rd election are going to be eligible even if they show up days later. Michigan's anticipating waves of absentee ballots this fall. About 2.3 million have already been requested. Michigan law requires absentee ballots to be received by the time polls close on Election Day in order to be counted. But Judge Cynthia Stevens said today that the flexibility is crucial in the 2020 election because of the coronavirus and chronic mail delays. Separately, another judge blocked Michigan's long-standing ban on transporting voters to the polls. A Native American voting rights group and 2 tribes have filed a federal lawsuit against South Dakota state agencies, alleging that the state is violating federal law by failing to offer adequate voter registration services. The lawsuit alleges that the state's agencies did not provide ample opportunities to register to vote or update voter registration information at places like motor vehicle and public assistance offices in areas near Native American reservations. Federal law requires the agencies to help people to register to vote at those kinds of offices, including ones that provide public assistance or serve people with disabilities. The Oglala Sioux Tribe, the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, and 4 Directions, a voting rights group supported by the Native American Rights Fund, NARF, have brought the lawsuit. Victoria Wicks reports from Rapid City.
NARF senior attorney Natalie Landreth says state agencies who offer motor vehicle and public assistance services must help clients register to vote, and they have to pass along changes of address to county auditors who keep voter registration records.
And it's supposed to be offered to you when you interact with the state at a number of different points, and it's just not happening.
The complaint lists the Secretary of State along with Secretaries of Social Services, Labor, and Public Safety as defendants. Those agencies are accused of not training employees sufficiently or providing paperwork that complies with the federal law.
And as a result, you're seeing a significant decline in voter registration in South Dakota.
Landreth says the state's failure especially affects people who have to travel a significant distance to meet with state agents. Tribal members on reservations might fit that description, but so do rural residents and people without vehicles who have to find rides.
And we refer to this as the tyranny of distance. That a lot of voter suppression, a lot of access issues where people just can't get to the registration office, they just can't get to the poll, is because it is simply just so far away.
Landreth says the federal voting law provides a process for agencies to register voters who don't have a Social Security number or a driver's license. But she says some agencies are sending those applicants to the county auditor instead. For National Native News, I'm Victoria Wicks in Rapid City, South Dakota.
President Trump's supporters plan to cast their ballot on Election Day, while about half of Joe Biden's backers plan to vote by mail. That's according to a new poll from the Associated Press and the Center for Public Affairs Research that finds 54% of voters say they will vote before polls open on November 3rd. The poll finds that 39% of registered voters say they will vote by mail, well above the 21% who say they normally do. 53% Biden supporters plan to vote by mail. 57% of Trump backers say they'll vote in person on Election Day. The coronavirus pandemic has led Europe's largest security organization to drastically scale back plans to send as many as 500 observers to the United States to monitor the November 3rd presidential election. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe told the Associated Press today that it will now deploy just 30 observers. The Vienna-based organization is better known for monitoring elections in countries such as Belarus or Kyrgyzstan, but it has spent months trying to figure out how to safely keep tabs on the U.S. election. The organization says it's worried the election will be the most challenging in recent decades as Americans pick a president during a pandemic. The New York Times reports that last month's heavily criticized federal guidance saying that asymptomatic people who've been exposed to the coronavirus do not need to be tested was posted to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website over the serious objections of CDC scientists. The Times reports that the Department of Health and Human Services rewrote the guidance and posted it on the CDC website, overriding the agency's strict scientific review procedures. In response to a question by the New York Times to CDC Director Robert Redfield, the agency emailed a statement from Redfield saying, quote, the guidelines coordinated in conjunction with the White House Coronavirus Task Force received appropriate attention, consultation, and input from task force experts. A former acting director of the CDC, Dr. Richard Besser, told The Times that, quote, the idea that someone at HHS would write guidelines and have it posted under the CDC banner is absolutely chilling. California schools that haven't resumed in-person instruction will not be allowed to do so if the counties where they are located are moved to a more restrictive tier due to rising coronavirus cases. The state's Department of Public Health says K through 12 schools can reopen in a county once it's been moved out of the most restrictive purple tier, signaling widespread virus transmission, for 2 weeks. But if they don't, and the county returns to that tier, they can no longer do so. That could affect San Diego County, which has seen a recent rise in coronavirus cases tied to San Diego State University. Some schools had planned for in-person classes to resume in late September and October. A second wave of coronavirus infections is sweeping across many European nations. The World Health Organization warns that European cases rose last week at a faster rate than they had during the European peak of the pandemic last March. The WHO official said more than half of European countries have reported a greater than 10% increase in cases in the past 2 weeks. Cases have been spiking in France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, and Britain. European Union leaders were set to discuss the pandemic in Brussels today, as Lucy Huff reports.
All EU leaders are expected to dial into the conference call, which will be coordinated by the Council President Charles Michel, with the virus now officially spread to all 27 member states. It comes in the wake of Italy's unprecedented decision to impose quarantine measures on the entire country, affecting some 60 million people. France has joined Italy in calling for a major and coordinated fiscal response to the crisis from the EU amid concern about the growing economic impact of the crisis. The EU revealed on Monday that it's lost €1 billion in tourism revenue since January. There's a meeting of finance ministers taking place in Brussels next week to discuss measures to mitigate the crisis.
Lucy Huff in Brussels. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says a second wave of the coronavirus is coming on a day when the government reported 4,322 new confirmed cases, the highest since early in May. England's preparing for more restrictions on gatherings and other activities in several areas of the country. And there's growing speculation Britain may be sliding toward a lockdown in the coming weeks, partly because the testing regime is struggling to cope with higher demand. Ali Barrett reports from London.
The UK government's considering tightening restrictions nationwide to slow the accelerating spread of COVID-19. It's reported the government's scientific advisors are suggesting a 2-week national circuit breaker, although schools and workplaces would remain open. It comes with a growing number of UK regions under local lockdown measures. UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock says the government doesn't want a national lockdown.
I understand that we are at a very serious moment where there's an acceleration in the number of cases. The hospitalizations are going up. Now, the last line of defense is a national lockdown. I want to avoid that. And local lockdowns are the tool that we have in our armory. We're prepared to take the action that is necessary. The way together that we avoid that is by the nation following the rules.
From Feature Story News in London, I'm Ollie Barrett.
India's coronavirus cases have jumped by another 96,000 infections in the past 24 hours, and they showed little signs of slowing down. The health ministry said 1,174 more people died in the past 24 hours. India is expected within weeks to surpass the reported infections in the United States. Prime Minister Narendra Modi yesterday made a fresh appeal to people to use face masks and maintain social distances as his government laid out plans to handle big congregations expected during a major Hindu festival season that begins next month. Simon Marks has more.
India has become only the second country after the US to record more than 5 million cases of COVID-19.
Though the government claims that the fatality rate in India is low, the country's COVID-19 battle has no scope of relaxation as it has not been able to flatten the curve since the pandemic began.
That's FSN's Sriyoshi Mukherjee reporting from our bureau in New Delhi.
Many experts believe that India's death toll is being underreported, but there is no definitive number to back this claim. After opening up public transport, restaurants, markets and workplaces, many state governments are ready to reopen schools from Monday, but only for senior students. Attendance will not be compulsory, but parents need to give their consent before sending their children to school.
Simon Marks reporting. A firefighter has died battling a wildfire in California that officials say was sparked by a device used to reveal a baby's gender. The U.S. Forest Service says the death happened yesterday in the San Bernardino National Forest as crews battled the El Dorado fire. The California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, or CAL FIRE, has said that wildfire was sparked by a smoke-generating pyrotechnic device used for a gender reveal party. The cause of the firefighter's death is under investigation. Wildfires in California this year are blamed for at least 25 deaths. New evacuation orders for the growing Bobcat Wildfire in mountains northeast of Los Angeles. Officials issued an evacuation order for the small forest town of Wrightwood on the fire's northeast side. Earlier in the day, residents were ordered to leave the community of Juniper Hills in foothills on the north flank of the San Gabriel Mountains. Officials say the fire is again threatening Mount Wilson, which is the site of an historic observatory and an array of broadcast antennas. Yosemite National Park was closed to all visitors due to significant smoke impact from the Creek Fire. This morning, the particulate matter reading was a high of 355 in the hazardous category. A park spokesperson told the Fresno Bee the Creek Fire in the Sierra National Forest is growing closer to Yosemite's southern border. Containment on the North Complex fire burning in Butte and Plumas counties is now at about 40%. A CAL FIRE spokesperson said a new daily tally shows 727 homes destroyed and another 36 damaged in that blaze. More than 44 businesses have also been destroyed. You're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF in Fresno, online at kpfa.org. It's an hour-long newscast, and it airs each night at 6 o'clock. There's a half-hour edition on the weekends, and you can listen to any of those newscasts whenever you like. They're archived online at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. This week, a United Nations mission blamed the Venezuelan government for extrajudicial executions, kidnappings, arbitrary detentions, and torture of residents since 2014, and demanded that those responsible be held accountable. The mission said it investigated 223 cases, including 48 in-depth case studies, in its 411-page report. It also said it examined another 2,891 cases to corroborate patterns of the violations. A scathing, in-depth report commissioned by the Human Rights Council said the people responsible for extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detentions, and other crimes must be held to account to provide justice for untold thousands of victims and to ensure such crimes don't happen again. The findings of the report are likely to ratchet up pressure on President Maduro's government, which has overseen a country in tatters. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza lashed out at the report, saying it was written by an alleged fact-finding mission that was actually led by a group of nations set on attacking Venezuela. Arreaza said on Twitter the report, plagued by falsehoods, was drawn up from afar without relaying without relying on rigorous methodology by government subordinate to Washington. More from Li Ling Tan.
The killing of protesters, politically motivated detention and torture, and extrajudicial killings are only fractions of what investigators found when they looked into reports of human rights violations in Venezuela. Even more damning, the investigation found that much of these violations involved high-level officials and were part of state policy, according to one of the investigators, Francisco Coxvial.
We have involvement and contribution to the crime by Mr. Maduro, either directly through the chain of command and sometimes circumventing the chain of command and giving the direct order.
The fact-finding mission say Venezuela must hold accountable those responsible for the violations and prevent them from occurring again. Li Ling Tan, New York.
The United Nations top human rights body today passed a resolution backed by the European Union seeking quick and enhanced scrutiny of alleged violations in Belarus by authorities under President Alexander Lukashenko after rejecting efforts to squelch speakers and water down the text. The Human Rights Council voted 23-2 with 22 abstentions on the resolution that calls on the UN Human Rights Chief to look into the situation on rights in the former Soviet Republic and report back by year end. The 47-member body rejected 17 amendments that had sought to alter the language. And the vote followed a dramatic, urgent debate in which Belarus and backers, like China, Russia, and Venezuela, sought to muzzle speakers like Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, a former English teacher who placed second to Lukashenko in the country's disputed presidential election last month. The four countries had, in essence, argued a breach of procedural rules that let her and others speak. However, the council president, the Austrian ambassador in Geneva, allowed the speakers to continue to decry a string of alleged rights violations in Belarus. Meanwhile, Belarus's president, beleaguered by 6 weeks of mass protests demanding his resignation, announced he's putting troops on high alert and closing the country's borders with Poland and Lithuania. Julia Chapman reports from Moscow.
President Lukashenko has blamed the West for fomenting unrest in Belarus and accused NATO of building up troops along the country's borders. NATO has denied any such action. On Friday morning, Polish officials said the border with Belarus was still open. This week, European lawmakers voted to stop recognizing Lukashenko as president from November, when his current term expires. The effort was led by Lithuanian MEPs who are trying to put pressure on Lukashenko to step down. Opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya remains in exile in Lithuania.
And that's reporter Julia Chapman in Moscow. Colleagues of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny say a bottle of water with a trace of the Novichok nerve agent was found in his hotel room in the Siberian city of Tomsk after he fell ill on a flight to Moscow last month. Navalny was later flown to a German hospital for treatment, where he's now breathing on his own after being brought out of a coma. Members of his team accused the Kremlin of involvement. Russian officials have denied it. Navalny's Instagram account said members of his team went to the hotel room on August 20th, an hour after learning he was ill, and packed up the bottles and other items for inspections. There had been previous speculation that Navalny was poisoned at the airport, where he drank a cup of tea before boarding his flight. House Democrats are preparing a temporary spending bill that's needed to avert a government shutdown at the end of the month. It's a lowest common denominator, bare minimum measure that befits a deeply polarized Congress. But even so, it took intense effort at the highest levels of Washington to finish the package. It was set to be released this afternoon after last-minute negotiating flurry. Republicans denied Democratic requests involving the census and election administration funding grants. What remains is said to be not controversial and includes provisions that would extend federal highway and flood insurance programs, along with a variety of other low-profile items. The bill does not contain any COVID-19 relief measures. Democratic House leaders delayed a vote on a measure to decriminalize and tax marijuana at the federal level. The decision was an apparent attempt to protect moderate Democrats against charges they cared more about marijuana than coronavirus relief. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer said in a statement that Democratic leaders were committed to bringing the measure to the floor for a vote before the end of the year. He said the measure remains a critical component of House Democrats' plan for addressing systemic racism and advancing criminal justice reform. But Hoyer said that right now the House is focused on securing agreement to stave off a damaging government shutdown and addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. The House Judiciary Committee approved the marijuana decriminalization bill last November. It has 110 Democratic co-sponsors, but only one Republican, Florida's Matt Gaetz. The pro-marijuana group NORML lamented the delay, saying in a statement that it appeared the prohibitionists and concern mongers have carried the day. The group vowed to press on. San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin announced his office has formed an Innocence Commission to evaluate criminal convictions that may have been wrongfully decided. The newly formed independent fact-finding commission will bring recommendations to the district attorney with the goal of resentencing excessive convictions or overturning the wrongful ones. KPFA's Chris Lee reports.
Members of the Innocence Commission say that this is truly the first example in the country where a volunteer body outside a district attorney's office has been tasked with evaluating cases where incarcerated people claim they were wrongfully convicted. Lodoris Cordell is one member of the Innocence Commission. She is a retired judge who served as the first independent police auditor in the city of San Jose.
This is, in my view, it's even more than reform. It's digging deeper. It's actually looking into convictions that may have been wrongfully concluded and actually being able to do something about it. At a time when our criminal justice system is finally being scrutinized for the many problems that it has, it's really refreshing to be a part of a movement coming out of the San Francisco District Attorney's Office to actually be doing something. My hope is we're going to do some groundbreaking work here and the work that other jurisdictions will. My hope is we're going to do some groundbreaking work here and the work that other jurisdictions will emulate.
The other 5 members of the Pro Bono Innocence Commission are medical expert Dr. George Wood, Executive Director of the Northern California Innocence Project, Linda Starr, San Francisco Managing District Attorney Arcelio Hurtado, San Francisco Deputy Public Defender Jack Wilson, and Professor Laura Bazelon, Director of the Racial Justice Clinic at University of San Francisco Law School, who is serving as chair of the commission. Bazelon says the only seat still open is the staff attorney, who is the only paid person working with the Innocence Commission. She says she hopes to hire that person in the next 4 to 6 weeks, as the first cases are already waiting in the SFDA's pipeline for them to review. She also says that in her experience, claims of wrongful conviction tend to languish in the bureaucracy of the justice system.
A lot of times when you have claims of wrongful conviction that are brought to district attorney's offices, in my experiences with LA County, the response is to fight those claims tooth and nail. And one of the ways that DAs do that is they'll say things like, well, your client isn't within the statute of limitations, or, well, other courts have considered and rejected those claims, so I'm not going to look at them. Essentially, what a lot of district attorneys will do is weaponize procedural technicalities to avoid ever having to confront the truth of what the person is saying. And what we have in San Francisco, DA Boudin has said he will not do that, and he will not stand on these technicalities to avoid having to confront the reality of what's happened to these people.
San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin was elected on an anti-incarceration platform, and his office says he is beginning to deliver on that promise. Rachel Marshall, policy advisor and assistant DA, says her office is hard at work, not only promoting fair sentencing practices through their post-conviction unit, but also looking back and actively correcting sentences that may have been concluded wrongfully. Marshall says she is hopeful that their model could set a positive example for district attorneys across the country.
We're hoping that this is going to be a model for DA's offices around the country. And part of the reason we hope that this is a good model for them is that if they don't have the budget, for example, to the extent that resources are an issue in other locations, this is, I think, a really good, sustainable model that we're hoping will spread across the country. Because sometimes you have in a lot of these other models, you'll have prosecutors reviewing their own colleagues' convictions. So this is to ensure that there are independent experts who are really looking at these cases carefully without the tendency to preserve convictions obtained by their colleagues.
Supporters of the move say that the Innocence Commission could help reverse the trend of wrongful convictions, which disproportionately impact Black communities and communities of color. According to a report published this year by the National Registry of Exonerations, African Americans, who constitute 13% of the United States population, represent 49% of all exonerations in the United States, indicating that Black Americans are more than 3 times as likely to be wrongfully convicted. I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
And this is the evening news on KPFA, or KPFB in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
The U.S. Commerce Department said today it will ban Chinese-owned TikTok and WeChat from U.S. app stores on Sunday and will bar the apps from accessing essential internet services in the U.S., a move that could effectively wreck the operation of both Chinese services for U.S. users. TikTok won't face the most drastic sanctions until after the November 3rd election, but WeChat users could feel the effects as early as Sunday. The order, which cites national security and data privacy concerns, follows weeks of deal-making over the video-sharing service TikTok. President Trump has pressured the app's Chinese owner to sell TikTok's U.S. operations to a domestic company to satisfy U.S. concerns over TikTok's data collection and related issues. California tech giant Oracle recently struck a deal with TikTok along those lines, but the details remain foggy and the administration is still reviewing it. More from reporter Nick Harper.
The U.S. Commerce Department made the announcement that the ban of the video sharing app TikTok and the messaging app WeChat is now just days away. It means U.S. business transactions and downloads of the apps in the U.S. will no longer be possible from Sunday. The U.S. has cited national security concerns, namely the Chinese government's possibility of accessing U.S. users' data, as the reason behind the decision. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says a full ban of TikTok will come into effect from November the 12th. Meanwhile, President Trump is still weighing whether Oracle can become a trusted technology partner for TikTok and oversee operations of it in the U.S. I'm Nick Harper in Washington.
China's military sent 18 planes, including fighter jets, over the Taiwan Strait in an unusual large show of force today, as the U.S. envoy held a day of closed-door meetings on the self-governing island claimed by China. Undersecretary of State Keith Cratch, who handles the economic growth, energy, and the environment portfolio, held talks with Taiwan's Minister of Economic Affairs and the Vice Premier. He also met with business leaders over lunch and was to dine with the president later today. In response to Cratch's visit, the Eastern Theater Command of the Chinese People's Liberation Army held combat exercises near the Taiwan Strait in at least the second round of war games this month, aimed at asserting its authority over Taiwan. Reporter Simon Marks has more.
A top American official landed in Taipei on Thursday in defiance of Beijing's insistence that the visit of Undersecretary of State Keith Kroc undermines China's ties with Washington. China also threatened retaliation for the visit, which comes amid reports that the Trump administration is planning a $7 billion package of new arms sales to the government in Taipei. Bob McMahon is an analyst with the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations.
Taiwan is a democracy at this point. It is recognized as such by only a handful of countries, and China has been moving determinedly to reduce that number. But Taiwan's having a moment right now, and it's having a moment in which it's able to first show its capabilities in terms of its response to the coronavirus. It's been extremely capable. It has seemed to handle skillfully so far its relationship with the Trump administration. So all sorts of things going on the Taiwan front at a time when China would rather be sort of closing in on, asserting its sovereignty over Taiwan.
The Trump administration in particular is prioritizing its relationship with Taiwan. The package of arms sales may be presented to Congress for approval within the next few weeks. The White House hopes a recalibration of ties that downgrades Beijing but upgrades Taiwan will become a fait accompli for whoever finds themselves in the Oval Office at the end of January. Simon Marks reporting.
The U.S. Department of Education is threatening to withhold some federal funding from Connecticut school districts if they follow a state policy that allows transgender girls to compete as girls in high school sports. In response to a complaint filed last year by several female track athletes who argued that two transgender female runners had an unfair physical advantage, the federal agency's Office for Civil Rights determined in May that Connecticut's policy violates the civil rights of athletes who are not transgender. School districts, including New Haven, as well as the Capital Region Education Council, were asked to sign a document to receive grants from a program for magnet schools that states they will not participate in any interscholastic sporting events unless the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference changes its policy on transgender athletes. The Federal Magnet Schools Assistance Program grants are worth about $3 million a year to New Haven and the Education Council. The Athletic Conference has said its policy is designed to comply with a state law that requires all students to be treated as the gender with which they identify. But the U.S. Education Department's Office for Civil Rights argues the policy violates the civil rights of girls who are not transgender under Title IX, the federal law that guarantees equal opportunities in education. New Haven Mayor Justin Alicker and Timothy Sullivan, Jr., the superintendent of schools for the Education Council, said they have no intention of signing the document. The House of Representatives Education and Labor Committee has called in civil rights experts to testify on a wide array of discriminatory policies backed by the Trump administration and the negative impact of those policies on the lives of women and LGBTQ people in healthcare and education. Chris Lee reports.
In June, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, announced it would roll back anti-discrimination rules, curbing protections for transgender people in healthcare settings. Sacha Boucard is a senior attorney with Lambda Legal, an LGBTQ organization specializing in civil rights law.
No federal agency has targeted LGBTQ people more than the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the agency tasked with enhancing the health and well-being of all Americans. Lambda Legal has now filed 6 different lawsuits against HHS in the last 3.5 years to block administrative changes that invite harm to our community. One of the most pernicious attacks from HHS came less than three months ago, well into the pandemic, when HHS chose to finalize a rule seeking to carve out clarification that LGBTQ people, women, and other vulnerable communities are protected under the non-discrimination provisions of Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act.
5 days before the HHS finalized its decision, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Bostock versus Clayton County, effectively banning employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in accordance with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. That landmark ruling also set a new precedent by clarifying the discrimination on the basis of sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Before HHS finalized its new rule, Boucart says the agency was quickly informed that their new rule would fly in the face of the new federal ruling. But the agency published its new policy. Despite this, the HHS rule has been enjoined by 2 different federal courts. According to Representative Johanna Hayes, Democrat from Connecticut, her state laws are consistent with the Bostock decision. However, despite the Supreme Court's ruling, the Department of Education is threatening to withhold millions of dollars into Connecticut schools because of their policy to allow trans students to participate in school as their chosen gender identity. Hayes says the grant funds being withheld were specifically designed to help promote diversity and equitable education in public schools.
There's a whole lot about the journey of transgender youth that I don't understand. I don't understand, gender identity and expression and how it presents itself at different ages. But what I do understand is discrimination and the fact that these are somebody's children, and it is our job to protect these children. And federal funding should not be contingent upon that protection.
Fatima Gross-Graves says this withholding of funds to Connecticut schools is a clear violation of Title IX in the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. But Graves says restricting funding isn't the only way that Trump-era policies hurt students. In May, the Department of Education published a rule that weakened Title IX protections for student survivors of sexual violence and harassment by making it harder for students to meet the burden of proof. She explains that student survivors who are already in an impossible position now have another set of barriers to overcome in order to get justice.
And this new Title IX will put students in schools in a terrible position. Under this rule, schools are required to dismiss many types of Title IX complaints. But no school should be even allowed, much less required, to dismiss a complaint simply because the student was raped at an off-campus party, or because each incident of the harassment they endured for months isn't considered severe by itself, or because a student dropped out of school when it was hard to be in the same class as their assailant. Nor should schools be allowed to ignore complaints because the respondent graduated or because a student reported it to a coach rather than to the dean.
The new rule also requires that survivors be subject to cross-examination when no such cross-examination exists for any other civil rights violation. According to Graves, this policy paints survivors as deeply unreliable and is rooted in skepticism of sexual assault itself. Further, she says this rule will make schools less safe. I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
A whistleblower from the Department of Homeland Security delayed his testimony to Congress today. Brian Murphy had been invited to give a deposition on Monday on his claim that he was pressured to suppress facts in intelligence reports. But his lawyer says he won't be able to testify until the Homeland Security Department gives him more access to relevant information. Murphy said in the complaint that he was pressured by more senior officials to suppress facts in intelligence reports that President Trump might find objectionable, including information about Russian interference in the election and the rising threat posed by white supremacists. And a lawyer for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has told a London court her client was indirectly offered a win-win deal by President Trump that would see him avoid extradition to the U.S. if he revealed the source of a leak of documents from the Democratic Party ahead of the 2016 election. Assange, who did not reveal the source of the leak of the Democratic National Committee emails, is fighting efforts by the U.S. to extradite him to face an array of charges. The extradition hearing is due to last until early October. Clouds tomorrow morning throughout the San Francisco Bay Area, clearing by the afternoon with highs in the low 70s. Further inland, it will be mostly sunny with highs in the mid-80s. In the central San Joaquin Valley, sunny, highs in the mid-80s. In Los Angeles, sunny with highs.
This is a community announcement for September 2020. Yoga and Qigong instructor Amelia Barilli continues to offer a free 1-hour workshop via Zoom every Saturday. These workshops are designed to de-stress as well as boost and balance the immune system. The Spanish language workshop is at 11 a.m. The English language workshop is at 3 p.m. The Zoom link is posted on her site at ameliabarilli.com. She also has health information on her YouTube channel, The New Paradigms. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your event for consideration to calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this announcement again, call 510-848-6767, extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.